Alright, so tonight we're going to look at the graphing of a cosine. So we did sine last night for notes as well as in class today, so today we're going to look at cosine, and then tomorrow we're going to do an activity with graphing, and we'll actually practice graphing cosine on Thursday. So for graphing of cosine, let's see, today's the 9th. We're going to do it very similar to how we did the sine. So I'm going to just make one graph up here. Let's see, might help if you can actually see what I'm writing. So let's see. One graph, and I'm just going to do my graphs all on the one. Just like sine, we start at 0 and we end at 2 pi. So I'm going to go ahead and mark my graph with my intervals, and I'm going to go 1, -1, 2, -2, and we're going to do, just like yesterday, we're going to do 3 different graphs to see what happens. So just like yesterday, we're going to start with a table of values, and I'm going to start with just the basic cosine of x. So again, I'm going to use just my key values of 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And we're going to plug these values into our function to get the y values. So if we plug in 0 for cosine, we get 1, because cosine of 0 is 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of pi is -1. 3 pi over 2 is 0, and cosine of 2 pi is 1 again. So again, these all come directly from the unit circle. So 0 to 1, pi over 2 is 0, pi was -1, 3 pi over 2 is 0, and 2 pi ends at 1. So we get a parent graph that looks something like this. And so if we look again at our amplitude, amplitude is highest to lowest, so that's a distance of 2. Divide that in half, and we have an amplitude of 1. So if we look at our coefficient, it was a 1, which makes sense that our amplitude would be 1. So let's go on to another one, and we're going to again touch on amplitude again, just to kind of review what that is. Here we're going to do 1/2 cosine x. So I'm going to stick with my same key values, and we're going to plug them into our function. So let's see, I'll do this one in teal. So cosine of 0 is 1, so 1/2 times 1 is 1/2. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0, 1/2 times 0 is 0. Cosine of pi is -1, so we're going to get -1/2. Cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0, so 0 times 1/2 is 0. And cosine of 2 pi is 1, so we end back at 1/2. So now when I start this, I'm going to go 1/2, 0, -1/2, 0, and then back to 1/2. So if we look at our highest to lowest, that's from 1/2 to -1/2, which is a total of 1. When we divide that by 2, we get 1/2. That would be our amplitude, which matches that number right there. So hopefully you guys are remembering between yesterday and today that the amplitude is found by this number in front, and that's how high you go from your middle line, how high you go up and how high you go down, so that way you get the whole amplitude. Okay, so last one I wanted to do here on this graph was y equals -2 cosine x. So this is similar to the one we did in class with a sign though. So 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So we'll do this one in purple. So -2 times cosine of 0 is 1. -2 times -1 is 2. So one of the things to remember, that negative is going to end up reflecting our graph. So instead of starting up and going through our pattern, we're going to start down and go backwards through our pattern. Pi over 2, cosine of pi over 2 is 0, so 0. Cosine of pi is -1, so -2 and -1 will bring us to +2. Cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0, and cosine of 2 pi is 1, giving us -2. So when we graph this one, we will be able to go through the same pattern. We're just starting low and ending high because of that negative. So this one is reflected across the x-axis, but it also, if we look at the amplitude, it's also got a distance of 4 from highest to lowest. So when we divide that in half, our amplitude is 2. So that's why it goes higher and lower than the other two. So again, one of the things that you want to look for is your amplitude as well as your reflections. So this is very similar to the sine graphs. We're just going to be adding in that negative piece. So what we're going to be looking at in the activity tomorrow is how to do some transformations with these graphs. Because this graph, what we've done so far, we've taken the high and the low and we've expanded them. So our high and our low, we can say get expanded when we multiply a number on the outside. Tomorrow we're going to look at what does multiplying a number on the inside do. So we're going to go over in class, in our activity, what this value does to the graph. So what does B do to the graph? Okay, we're also in our activity tomorrow going to look at not only what does B on the inside do to the graph, but what does something being added on the outside do to the graph? What does C do to the graph? And then these are two shifts that you should have seen before with your transformations last year. But we are going to go over them in our activity, as well as the fourth shift, which I know you haven't done, but we're going to do that on, I believe, Friday. So tomorrow we're just going to do an activity exploring what these two values do to a graph. And then on Thursday, we're actually going to do an assignment in class where we actually graph these. So again, if you're gone for the PSAT, I have a worksheet that gives you some practice on these two transformations that's similar to what they're doing in the activity. If you're a senior and you're in class, we'll just be doing this as our assignment in class, so you don't have to worry about bringing your book. So if you have questions or need reminders, or if you want to make a guess as to what you remember about those two values and what they do to your graph, go ahead and write it down and we'll see if you're right.